Summer 1991. Garden Lodge. Freddie Mercury asked Brian May to bring a specific kind of paper the next time he came to the house, heavy cream stock, the kind used for formal correspondence rather than everyday notes. And Brian, who had learned across the previous months not to ask too many questions about small requests that carried an unusual weight in Freddie's voice, brought exactly what was asked without inquiring further. Freddie spent 2 days with that paper before anyone saw what he had written on it, working alone in the small study off his bedroom during the hours when his strength allowed him to sit upright at a desk, and when he finally called Brian, Roger, and John together. An increasingly rare occurrence by that point in his illness, given how carefully his energy had to be rationed, he presented them with a single handwritten page that none of them had been told to expect. He said, "I've written something. Not a will, that's already handled by the lawyers. Something else. Something just for the four of us." The document, according to every account that survives from Brian and Roger across the decades since, was brief. 3 paragraphs in Freddie's own increasingly unsteady hand, addressing not the disposition of money or property, but something considerably less tangible. A set of intentions regarding how the band's music should be treated after he was gone. Phrased not as legal instruction, but as personal request, the specific difference mattering enormously to Freddie in ways he took care to explain before anyone was asked to respond to what he'd written. He wanted the songs to keep being played. He wanted them free to be reinterpreted, performed by other voices if the surviving 3 ever chose that path. Adapted for whatever future forms of performance or technology might exist decades ahead that none of them could yet imagine. But he wanted one thing held back from all that permitted freedom, one specific request that the document articulated with more careful precision than anything else it contained. He wanted the surviving members to make the final creative decisions about his own recorded voice together, unanimously, never by majority vote among the 3 of them, never by any single person's authority alone, a specific structural insistence on collective agreement that Brian has described in the handful of interviews where this document has been referenced at all. As characteristically Freddie, a man who during his lifetime had often been the loudest voice in any room now designing, for the version of himself that would exist only in archived recordings after his death, a system that could never again be dominated by any single loud voice, including whatever loud voice history might eventually attribute back to him. The document asked for a signature from each of the 3 men. Not as a legally binding requirement, Freddie was explicit about this. The lawyers had made clear that nothing in the handwritten page carried any enforceable weight beyond what the 3 men chose to honor voluntarily, but as what Freddie apparently called, according to Roger's later recollection, a promise made visible. Something more permanent than a conversation that could later be misremembered or reinterpreted. Something with ink and paper and their own hands attached to it. Brian signed first. He has described this moment across several interviews with a consistency that suggests genuine memory rather than narrative smoothing. The specific weight of picking up a pen in that small study, knowing exactly what he was agreeing to, and exactly who had asked him to agree to it. Roger signed second, and by his own account did so quickly, almost reflexively, understanding the document less as a negotiation to be considered than as an obvious extension of loyalty that required no deliberation at all. Freddie made 3 copies that afternoon, one for each of them, using what limited photocopying capability existed in the house, and the specific detail of 3 identical copies rather than one shared original has become, among people who have encountered fragments of this story, part of what makes it feel structurally significant rather than merely sentimental, evidence that Freddie wanted each man to carry his own physical proof of the agreement rather than relying on a single document held collectively. John Deacon's copy was handed to him last, according to every account that survives, and what happened next has become the specific detail this entire story turns on, repeated with remarkable consistency across the fragmentary testimony that has reached researchers over the decades since. John did not sign it that afternoon. He read it, according to Brian's recollection, carefully and completely, his face showing an expression Brian has struggled across the years to fully characterize. Something between deep consideration and a specific private reluctance that had nothing to do with disagreement over the document's substance. When Freddie asked, gently, whether something in the wording troubled him, John's response, as Brian has recounted it across several separate interviews using almost identical language each time, was quiet and immediate. No, Freddie, it's not the words. I just need to think about signing anything that starts with the assumption you won't be here to see it through. Freddie did not press him. This detail, too, has remained consistent across every version of the story. Freddie's specific restraint in that moment, choosing not to insist, choosing instead to fold his own copy carefully and set it aside, telling John, according to Roger's recollection, that there was no deadline attached to any of it, that he could sign whenever it felt right, or not sign at all, and that either choice would be understood and respected completely. John took his copy home that evening. He never brought it back. The weeks that followed absorbed everyone's attention into the accelerating realities of Freddie's declining health, and the unsigned document, according to every account, simply receded from active conversation without anyone deciding this should happen, the way genuinely difficult topics sometimes disappear from a household's daily attention, not because they've been resolved, but because more urgent matters keep displacing them. Freddie never asked John about it again directly, at least not in any conversation Brian or Roger were present for or ever heard described secondhand. Whether Freddie raised it privately with John in one of the increasingly private conversations that characterized his final months, conversations that even his closest bandmates were not always included in, remains entirely unknown, a specific gap in the record that neither Brian nor Roger has ever claimed to be able to fill with certainty. Freddie Mercury died on the 24th of November 1991. In the immediate aftermath, in the specific chaos of grief and arrangement, and the beginning of what would become decades of managing a shared legacy. The unsigned document apparently went unmentioned by anyone for a considerable stretch of time, both Brian and Roger later admitting, with some evident discomfort, that in the overwhelming days immediately following Freddie's death, a piece of paper representing an informal gentleman's understanding simply did not register as urgent compared to everything else that required their attention. It resurfaced, according to Roger's account, roughly 18 months later, during the early stages of what would eventually become the Made in Heaven sessions, when questions naturally began arising about exactly the kind of creative decision making the document had originally addressed. How to handle Freddie's final vocal fragments. What standard of agreement should govern choices about material that involved his voice specifically, rather than the band's collective work more broadly? Brian, by his own account, mentioned the document during one of these discussions, not as a demand, but as a reminder, the specific structural principle Freddie had articulated. Unanimous agreement rather than majority rule where his own voice was concerned. Roger confirmed he still had his signed copy. Brian confirmed the same. When the conversation turned to John, according to the account that has proven most consistent across its various retellings, John reportedly said only that he remembered the document, that he still had his copy, and that he intended to honor its spirit regardless of whether he had ever formally signed it. This specific detail, John's voluntary commitment to honor an agreement he had never actually signed, has become, among people who discuss this story, the element that carries the most weight. The suggestion that the signature itself had perhaps never been the point, that what Freddie had actually been asking for, without fully articulating it even to himself, was something closer to witnessed intention than legal formality. The three surviving members did in fact maintain something resembling the unanimous standard Freddie's document had requested across the subsequent decades of managing his recorded voice. Choices about unreleased material, about how his vocals could and couldn't be used in later projects. Consistently described in the limited public statements available as decisions reached collectively among Brian, Roger, and John's estate representatives, even during the specific stretch of years when John himself had become almost entirely unreachable through any conventional communication channel. Whether this consistency reflects the document's actual continuing influence or simply reflects three men who would have reached the same collaborative standard regardless of any piece of paper, remains, like so much of this story, genuinely unresolvable from the outside. What has never been resolved, what remains, according to every account available. An open question even to Brian and Roger themselves is the specific physical fate of John's unsigned copy, whether it still exists somewhere in his possession, folded away in a drawer or a box among the general accumulation of a private life lived deliberately out of public view. Whether it was ever actually signed in some private moment John chose never to disclose to anyone, or whether it was lost or discarded at some point across more than 3 decades of a life that has, by every available account, moved as far from its Queen-era visibility as any surviving band member's life reasonably could. Brian has said, in the rare interviews where this specific document comes up, that he has never asked John directly whether he eventually signed his copy. Explaining this reluctance with a specific logic that connects meaningfully to the same restraint Freddie himself showed in that original study at Garden Lodge. Freddie told him it was his choice, and it stayed his choice, Brian has said, according to the version of this quote that has circulated most consistently. Asking now would be asking him to explain a private decision to me 30 years later, and that's not something I think I have any right to. If he wants to tell me someday, he will. Roger has offered a similar sentiment across his own separate accounts, framing the unsigned document less as an unresolved mystery requiring solution than as a specific testament to something genuine about who John Deacon actually was, a man whose deepest commitments, according to Roger's characterization, were never the kind that required visible proof or public declaration. Someone capable of honoring and understanding completely while still, quietly and consistently, declining the specific formal gesture that would have made that honoring visible to anyone else. The specific psychological logic this attributes to John. Private conviction without public performance of that conviction aligns coherently with the broader and better documented pattern of his post-1997 withdrawal from nearly every form of public visibility connected to his Queen legacy. A man who has apparently continued caring deeply about decisions affecting Freddie's recorded voice while systematically declining every opportunity to be seen. Caring. What the story ultimately preserves, regardless of whether its specific details can ever be fully verified beyond Brian and Roger's consistent but secondhand testimony, is a particular window into the final months of Freddie Mercury's life that differs meaningfully from the more commonly told stories of that period. Focused not on his physical decline or his final creative sessions, but on a specific act of institutional foresight, a dying man attempting to design, with whatever paper and ink and gathered signatures he had available to him, a system that might protect his legacy from exactly the kind of division and disagreement that has fractured so many other artists' posthumous catalogs across the decades. Since his death, the 3 surviving members of Queen have, by nearly every available account, honored something resembling Freddie's original request across more than 3 decades, whether through the specific binding force of 2 visible signatures and 1 quietly honored unsigned promise, or simply through the deeper loyalty that made the document almost unnecessary from the moment Freddie first picked up his pen. The cream paper Freddie asked Brian to bring that summer afternoon in 1991 produced 3 copies of a single page, 2 of which carry visible ink confirming their signatories' agreement, and 1 of which, folded and taken home by a man who has spent more than 3 decades declining nearly every opportunity to explain himself to the public, remains. As far as anyone outside John Deacon's own private life has ever been able to confirm, permanently and deliberately unaccounted for.